"Clean my shoes before you speak," the man said without even looking at her, and the quiet that followed felt colder than the marble floor beneath their feet. The lobby of Hawthorne Financial Tower had always been a place where voices echoed softly against glass walls and polished steel, but now the air seemed to freeze mid-breath. Dozens of executives in tailored suits stood scattered around the reception area, waiting for the morning board meeting to begin, their conversations fading as they turned toward the scene unfolding near the security desk. The command had come from Charles Hawthorne himself, a billionaire whose name was etched in silver letters across the 60-story building outside. He stood tall in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, one hand adjusting the cuff of his watch, the other pointing casually at the dust on the tip of his shoe. In front of him stood a young black woman holding a gray janitor's cart, a spray bottle still in her hand. Maya Williams had only been working the night shift for 2 weeks, long enough to learn that most people in this building treated the cleaning staff like shadows, useful but invisible. She had mopped these floors at 2 in the morning while the city outside slept, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of taxis on Lexington Avenue. But now it was 8:15 a.m., rush hour in the lobby, and every pair of eyes seemed to land on her at once. Someone near the elevators let out a low chuckle. Another executive whispered something behind his hand. Maya glanced down briefly at the billionaire's Italian leather shoe, then back up at his face. She didn't kneel. The moment stretched long enough for the quiet hum of the escalator to become the loudest sound in the room. Charles finally looked directly at her, irritation flickering across his sharp features. "Did you hear me?" he asked, his voice calm, but edged with the kind of authority that usually made people move without question. Maya's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of the cleaning cart. The scent of lemon disinfectant hung faintly in the air around her. She could feel the weight of the lobby pressing in. The security guard pretending not to stare, the receptionist frozen behind her desk, the soft clicking of someone's expensive heels stopping mid-step. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to her like that. People often assumed a uniform meant obedience came with it. But Maya had spent too many nights reading textbooks under the dim light of her apartment kitchen table to forget who she was. Her grandmother used to say something whenever life pushed too hard. Dignity doesn't make noise, but it never kneels. Maya took a slow breath. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice steady enough to cut through the silence. "I clean floors, not people's pride." A few heads turned sharply. Someone near the back muttered, "Did she just?" but stopped before finishing the sentence. Charles Hawthorne blinked once, clearly not used to resistance from someone pushing a janitor's cart. For a split second his expression hardened, the faintest shadow of disbelief crossing his face. The billionaire who negotiated billion-dollar mergers without raising his voice suddenly found himself staring at a woman who refused to move. Around them, the lobby remained perfectly still, like a paused frame in a movie. Maya didn't raise her voice or step forward. She simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm, as if she had all the time in the world. The security guard shifted his weight. One of the junior analysts quietly pulled out his phone but hesitated before pressing record. Charles looked down again at the dust on his shoe, then back up at her. For the first time since walking into the building that morning, something unfamiliar flickered in his gaze. Not anger, something closer to curiosity. And though no one in the lobby realized it yet, that single moment, the billionaire demanding obedience and the janitor refusing to bend, was about to change far more than a pair of shoes. Because sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one that forces everyone else to listen. The lobby clock ticked louder than it should have. Maya Williams sat straight in the hard plastic chair of the security office, her borrowed sneakers planted firmly on the polished tile floor, hands folded tightly in her lap, so no one could see the faint tremble in her fingers. Across from her, a wall of security monitors flickered with quiet images of elevators sliding open, executives walking briskly through glass corridors, and the slow morning light pouring across the marble lobby of Hale Investments. The building felt different now, heavier somehow, like the air itself was waiting for a verdict. Beside her, Denise Williams kept her eyes fixed on the floor, the strap of her janitor cart still looped around her wrist like an anchor she refused to let go of. Neither of them had spoken for almost 40 minutes. The faint scent of industrial cleaners still clung to their uniforms, sharp and sterile, mixing with the aroma of roasted coffee drifting from the lobby cafe. Finally, Denise exhaled slowly. "Baby," she murmured without looking up, "next time you see something strange in a folder, you leave it alone." Maya nodded once, though her eyes remained steady. "Yes, ma'am." But inside her chest the memory replayed again and again. Page 14. Subparagraph C. The wording had been precise enough to hide the danger, but not precise enough to escape someone who had spent years studying how corporations protected themselves from collapse. She had not meant to embarrass anyone. She had only meant to stop a mistake. The door to the security office opened with a quiet click. Both women looked up instantly. A tall man in a navy suit stepped inside, followed by another executive carrying a tablet. Neither wore the relaxed confidence of the other people Maya had seen that morning. Their faces were tight, serious. "Miss Williams," the taller one said carefully. Maya stood immediately. "Yes, sir. Mr. Hale would like to speak with you." Denise stiffened beside her. "Is she in trouble?" The man hesitated a moment before answering. "That depends on what happens next." They led Maya through the lobby and into a private elevator normally reserved for executives. The doors closed with a soft hydraulic whisper. As the car began to rise, Maya could feel Denise's worried gaze burning into her back through the glass wall until the lobby disappeared below. The elevator ride to the 27th floor took less than 30 seconds, but it felt longer. The quiet hum of the cables vibrated through the metal floor. The executive beside her kept glancing down at the tablet, as if checking something he still did not quite believe. When the doors opened, the hallway outside the boardroom was silent. A row of framed financial awards lined the wall, reflecting pale morning light. At the far end stood Jackson Hale himself, hands clasped behind his back, staring through the tall window that overlooked the city skyline. For a moment he did not turn. The men who escorted Maya stepped aside. The boardroom door behind him was open now. Inside, several lawyers and analysts were hunched over copies of the contract, flipping pages, whispering urgently to one another. Finally, Jackson Hale turned around. His expression was calm, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed something deeper. He held a printed copy of the agreement in one hand, folded open exactly to page 14. "Miss Williams," he said slowly, studying her the way someone studies a puzzle piece that should not exist, "my legal team just confirmed that the clause you mentioned would indeed transfer all post-merger liability to my company." Maya said nothing. Jackson stepped closer, the polished floor echoing softly under his shoes. "3 senior attorneys reviewed this contract last night," he continued quietly. "2 financial auditors signed off on it. And yet the only person in this building who caught the trap was a 16-year-old girl wearing a janitor badge." The room behind him fell silent again as the lawyers looked up. Jackson's eyes never left Maya's. "So here is my question," he said. "How did you see something that all of them missed?" The lobby of Hale Investments felt colder than it had an hour earlier. Maya Williams sat upright in the hard security chair, her borrowed sneakers barely touching the polished marble floor, her janitor badge resting against the faded fabric of her hoodie like a label she could not peel off. Across the lobby, elevators opened and closed with quiet mechanical chimes, executives stepping out in press suits and moving quickly through the space without looking her way. Most of them pretended not to see the girl who had interrupted the most important meeting of their quarter. But every once in a while, someone slowed down. A glance. A whisper. Then they walked faster. Denise Williams sat beside her daughter with her hands folded tightly in her lap, the faint scent of lemon floor cleaner still clinging to her uniform. She had not scolded Maya. Not yet. But the tension in her shoulders said everything. Finally she spoke, her voice low and careful. "Maya, tell me the truth. Are you absolutely sure about what you said up there?" Maya swallowed. The question did not sound angry. It sounded afraid. "Yes, Mom," she answered quietly. "I read it 3 times. It moves. All the legal responsibility to Hale Investments if anything goes wrong after the merger." Denise looked down at the glossy floor tiles reflecting the afternoon light from the glass entrance doors. "That kind of mistake," she murmured slowly, "people lose jobs over things like that." Maya nodded once. "I know." The silence that followed stretched long enough for the security guard at the front desk to shift uncomfortably in his chair. Somewhere upstairs, unseen and unheard, the boardroom conversation had continued without her. Lawyers were reading. Assistants were checking documents. Analysts were whispering over tablets. And at the head of the long glass table, Jackson Hale was no longer holding his pen over the signature line. He was staring at page 14. Inside the conference room, the mood had changed completely. Derek Vaughn no longer leaned back in his chair with easy confidence. His fingers tapped against the table in slow, irritated rhythms as one of Hale Investments' legal advisors flipped through the document again. Page 14, subsection C, line 3, the lawyer muttered under his breath while adjusting his glasses. The room waited. Another executive pulled the digital contract onto a large screen mounted on the wall. The clause appeared in clean black letters. Harmless at first glance. Complicated legal language. Exactly the kind of wording that buried consequences under polite phrases. Jackson Hale leaned forward slightly. "Read it out loud," he said. The lawyer cleared his throat and began slowly, translating the dense legal text into plain English. As he reached the final sentence, his voice stopped. His eyes narrowed. He leaned closer to the screen. Derek Vaughn forced a thin smile. "Gentlemen, surely we are not delaying a billion-dollar agreement because of a misunderstanding from a cleaning girl." No one laughed. The lawyer finally turned around. "Mr. Hale, the liability transfer is real. If the merger collapses or legal disputes surface, your company absorbs the entire financial responsibility. Vaughn Global would be protected." A quiet breath moved through the room like wind through tall grass. Jackson Hale did not speak right away. His jaw tightened slowly as the reality settled into place. Across the table, Clara Hale looked from the document to her husband, her expression shifting from irritation to something more uneasy. Derek Vaughn straightened in his chair. "Contracts are complicated," he said lightly. "Language can always be interpreted in different ways." Jackson finally lifted his eyes. "No, Mr. Vaughn," he said calmly. "Not this way." The room fell silent again. Downstairs in the lobby, Maya shifted slightly in her chair, unaware that the balance of power 30 floors above her head had just tilted. The security guard glanced at his phone, then back at her, then toward the elevators as one of them opened again with a soft chime. This time, 3 senior executives stepped out together. They looked directly at the girl in the chair, and they were not smiling. The security office smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, the kind that had been sitting on a warmer since before sunrise. Maya Williams sat upright in the metal chair beside her mother, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the marble floor beyond the glass wall. Every sound inside the Hale Investments lobby felt louder than normal. The soft click of heels. The distant hum of elevators climbing 30 floors of quiet power. The whisper of suits passing by without looking at her. Denise Williams finally shifted beside her, arms crossed tight against her chest. "Maya, baby, tell me again what you said up there." Maya inhaled slowly. Her heart had stopped racing, but the weight in her stomach had not left. "I told him the clause transfers liability. Page 14. If they sign it, the entire merger risk falls on Hale Investments." Denise stared at her daughter like she was trying to measure the distance between pride and fear. "And you said that in front of all those executives?" "Yes, ma'am." A long pause settled between them. Across the room, the young security guard pretending not to listen adjusted a stack of visitor badges but kept glancing over. Denise leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Maya, those people run billion-dollar companies. They do not like being corrected by someone wearing a janitor badge." Maya nodded once. "I know. Then why did you say it?" Maya looked down at her hands. Her fingers still smelled faintly of glass cleaner. "Because it was wrong." Denise sighed slowly, the sound carrying years of exhaustion. "That answer might get us both fired." Maya said nothing. The silence stretched until the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. 3 executives stepped out, speaking in tight whispers. One of them glanced toward the security office. Their voices faded quickly down the hallway. Denise shook her head. "You always had that problem, Maya. Seeing things you should just walk past." Maya gave a faint smile. "Grandpa used to say ignoring the truth does not make it disappear." Denise softened a little at that. "Your grandfather also never had to worry about rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in Raleigh." Maya lowered her eyes again. Outside the glass wall, the giant lobby clock ticked toward noon. She could feel the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Somewhere above them, decisions were being made. Lawyers were checking documents. Executives were arguing behind closed doors. And all of it started because a 16-year-old janitor's daughter refused to stay quiet. Denise rubbed her temples. Do you think that man believed you? Maya pictured Jackson Hale's face in the boardroom. The way his pen stopped midair. The way his eyes shifted from annoyance to calculation. I do not know, she said quietly. But he looked at the page. Denise let out a slow breath. That is something. Another elevator opened. This time 2 men in dark suits stepped out and spoke quietly with the front desk manager. Their eyes drifted toward the security office. The manager nodded once and picked up the phone. Maya felt her pulse quicken again. The guard inside the office straightened in his chair as the desk phone rang sharply. He answered with a quick greeting, then listened. His expression changed. Slowly, he looked toward Maya. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Even Denise stopped moving. The guard covered the receiver with his hand. Miss Williams. Maya stood slowly. Yes. They want you upstairs again. Denise blinked in disbelief. Upstairs? The guard nodded once. 27th floor. Boardroom. Maya's chest tightened, but her posture stayed calm. Denise grabbed her wrist gently before she could move. Baby, listen to me. Those people can crush a person without even noticing. Maya met her mother's worried eyes and gave a quiet answer. Or they can listen. Denise searched her face for a long second. Then she let go. Maya walked toward the door. Each step across the marble floor echoed softly through the lobby. The elevator doors slid open with a low mechanical whisper. As she stepped inside, the reflective steel walls showed her the same thing everyone else saw. Borrowed sneakers. Faded hoodie. Maintenance badge hanging from a thin blue lanyard. The doors began to close. But in Maya's calm eyes, there was something the building's polished marble could not reflect. Certainty. The security office smelled faintly of floor polish and old coffee, the kind that had sat too long on a warming plate. Maya Williams kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers laced tightly enough that the knuckles had gone pale. Across the narrow room, a wall of monitors showed quiet camera feeds from every corner of Hale Investments. Marble lobby, parking garage, executive elevators gliding up and down in perfect silence. Everything looked calm. Too calm. Denise sat beside her, shoulders stiff beneath her cleaning uniform, her vacuum shift badge still clipped to the collar. She had not spoken for almost 40 minutes. Every now and then she glanced toward the hallway door, like a person waiting for a verdict they already feared. Maya focused on the floor instead. The polished tile reflected the cold white light overhead. She replayed the moment again and again in her mind. The contract. Page 14. Paragraph C. The disguised liability shift. She had not spoken to impress anyone. She had spoken because silence would have been easier, but wrong. A soft mechanical click broke the stillness. The hallway door opened. Both women looked up at the same time. It was not security this time. It was a man in a dark suit Maya had noticed earlier at the conference table. Late 40s. Thin glasses. Calm eyes that looked like they were always measuring something. He stepped into the room quietly and closed the door behind him. Miss Williams, he said. His voice carried none of the irritation that had filled the boardroom earlier. Maya stood slowly. Yes, sir. The man studied her for a moment, then glanced toward the cameras before speaking again. My name is Leonard Pike. I am Chief Legal Counsel for Hale Investments. Denise straightened in her chair immediately. Maya felt her heartbeat shift, not faster, but heavier. Pike held up a folder. The same contract. We reviewed the clause you mentioned, he said. The room remained silent for a moment. Denise gripped the edge of her seat. And Maya asked carefully. Pike adjusted his glasses and flipped open the document. His finger landed on the same line Maya had memorized earlier that morning. You were correct. Denise let out a breath she had been holding for an hour. Maya did not move. The clause does in fact transfer post-merger liability entirely to our side, Pike continued. If the deal collapsed, Hale Investments would absorb every lawsuit, every regulatory penalty, every debt obligation tied to Vaughn Global. Maya nodded slightly. It is written to look neutral, but the wording removes shared responsibility. Pike looked up at her again. Yes, exactly that. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Not hostile, just thoughtful. Pike closed the folder slowly. Mr. Hale has postponed the signing for further review. Maya blinked once. Only once. Denise leaned forward. You mean she was right? Pike allowed the faintest hint of a smile. That is precisely what I mean. Through the glass window behind him, Maya could see executives moving quickly across the lobby above them, phones pressed to their ears, assistants carrying folders like emergency supplies. The calm illusion had cracked. Pike slid the contract back into the folder and tucked it under his arm. "May I ask you something, Miss Williams?" "Yes, sir." "Where did you learn to read legal risk language like that?" Maya hesitated. She did not feel embarrassed, just aware of the strange distance between this room and the one upstairs. "My grandfather used to review municipal contracts when I was little," she said quietly. "I read them with him sometimes." Pike studied her again, this time with open curiosity. "Your grandfather was a lawyer?" "No, sir. He fixed elevators." "The lawyer lived upstairs from him." Denise almost smiled. Pike blinked, then gave a soft exhale that sounded very close to respect. "Well," he said, "it appears those evenings paid off." He turned toward the door, then paused. "One more thing." Maya waited. "Mr. Hale asked that you and your mother remain here a little longer." Denise stiffened again. "Are we in trouble?" Pike shook his head slowly. "No." His voice softened slightly. "I believe he wants to meet the girl who just saved his company from signing a very expensive mistake." The security office smelled faintly of old coffee and floor polish, the kind that left a thin chemical sweetness in the air. Maya Williams sat perfectly still on the metal chair, her borrowed sneakers barely touching the gray tile floor. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting a pale reflection across the security monitors lining the wall. Beside her, her mother Denise kept both hands folded tightly. In her lap, knuckles pale, shoulders rigid from hours of silent worry. Neither of them spoke. Outside the glass window of the office, the lobby of Hale Investments moved like a quiet river of suits and polished shoes. Executives passed by without looking in. Assistants whispered into phones. The marble floor reflected everything with cold precision. Maya watched it all without moving. Her heart had finally slowed, but the weight of what had happened upstairs still pressed against her ribs like a heavy book resting on her chest. She had interrupted a billion-dollar meeting. She had challenged men whose watches probably cost more than the apartment she shared with her mother. And yet the memory that lingered most in her mind was not the shock on their faces. It was the brief moment when Jackson Hale had looked at her differently. Not like a janitor's daughter. Like someone worth listening to. The office door creaked open quietly. Both Maya and Denise looked up at the same time. It was not security. It was the elderly guard who had escorted them downstairs earlier, Mr. Alvarez, a man with tired eyes and a silver mustache that curled slightly at the ends. He stepped inside holding 2 small paper cups. The scent of warm cocoa drifted through the room. "Thought you two might need something warm," he said gently, setting the cups on the small desk beside Maya. Denise blinked in surprise. "Thank you," she said softly. Maya wrapped her fingers around the cup, letting the warmth settle into her cold hands. For a moment, none of them spoke. The building outside continued its silent rhythm of power and money, but inside the little security room, something softer lingered. Mr. Alvarez leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely. "You know," he said after a moment, "I have worked in this building 18 years. I have seen a lot of meetings. A lot of big men with bigger egos." Maya glanced up, unsure where he was going with this. "But I have never seen one stopped by a kid in a janitor badge before." Denise gave Maya a sideways look, half worried, half proud. Maya lowered her eyes to the cocoa. "I was not trying to stop anything," she said quietly. "I just did not want them to sign something that could ruin them." Mr. Alvarez nodded slowly, studying her face like he was trying to understand something deeper. Most people would have kept quiet, especially someone in your position. Maya shrugged gently. "If you see a car about to drive off a broken bridge, you do not stay quiet just because you are not the driver." The old guard chuckled softly under his breath. "That is a pretty serious way of looking at things for someone your age." Maya lifted the cup slightly, the steam brushing against her face. "My grandfather used to say that responsibility does not check your job title before it shows up." Denise finally smiled a little at that. She had heard that line many times before at their kitchen table late at night. Mr. Alvarez pushed himself off the wall and walked toward the monitors. On one of the screens, the elevator doors opened on the executive floor. A group of lawyers stepped out, their expressions tense. Something was happening upstairs. He looked back at Maya again, his voice softer now. "Whatever happens next, kid, remember something. You did not speak because you were brave. You spoke because you were honest. And honesty scares powerful people more than anything else. Maya absorbed that quietly. The cocoa warmed her throat as she took a slow sip. Outside the security office window, the tall glass doors of Hale Investments reflected the late afternoon sun now stretching across the city. Light spilled across the marble floor like liquid gold. For the first time since security had brought her downstairs, Maya felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just a little. Not because she knew what would happen next, but because deep down, she knew she would not take her words back even if she could. The office was too quiet for someone whose life had just been shaken open. Maya Williams sat alone at the long conference table on the 31st floor. The thick binder Veronica Ellison had given her resting open beneath the pale glow of a desk lamp. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Hudson River moved slowly under the late afternoon light, gray water reflecting streaks of gold as the sun drifted toward evening. The building that had felt enormous and intimidating that morning now felt strangely still, as if the entire place were holding its breath. Maya traced her finger along a paragraph on page 14, the same clause she had pointed out earlier in the boardroom. The words looked harmless at first glance, wrapped in dense legal language and polished corporate phrasing, but she knew how to read between the lines. Liability reassignment. Conditional authority override. Risk displacement. The kind of clause that looked like protection but quietly shifted every consequence onto the wrong shoulders. She exhaled slowly and leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking beneath her weight. Her reflection floated faintly in the dark glass of the window. For a moment she saw not the girl in a hotel service uniform but the version of herself from years ago, sitting in a quiet office in Abu Dhabi, reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with the same careful attention. It felt like another life, one that had closed when her mother became sick and the world shrank to hospital corridors, medical bills, and sleepless nights. She blinked and returned her eyes to the page. Footsteps passed faintly in the hallway outside, then faded again. Somewhere deeper in the building an elevator chimed softly. Otherwise there was only the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the slow turning of pages as Maya continued reading. She was halfway through the binder when something else caught her attention. A secondary clause, buried deeper in the appendix, referencing the same liability structure but with an added layer of arbitration control. Her brow tightened. That detail had not appeared in the presentation slides earlier that day, which meant someone had deliberately hidden the full language from the room. Maya sat up straighter, the chair legs scraping softly against the floor. She read the paragraph again, slower this time. If the merger collapsed or triggered regulatory investigations, Hale Investments would assume not only financial penalties, but legal responsibility for every operational action taken by Vaughn Global during the transition period. In simple terms, if anything went wrong, Jackson Hale's company would carry the blame while Vaughn Global walked away untouched. Maya closed her eyes briefly and pictured the moment in the boardroom again. The polished table, the quiet tension, Derek Vaughn's confident smile, Jackson Hale holding the pen seconds from signing. A chill ran lightly along her arms. That had not been an accident. Someone had expected the deal to move quickly without a deeper review. Someone had counted on the room, trusting the summary rather than the language itself. Maya pressed her lips together and flipped another page. The more she read, the clearer the pattern became. Every clause subtly shifted leverage in Vaughn Global's favor while appearing neutral on the surface. It was clever, almost elegant in the way it hid its intention. The kind of drafting that only experienced corporate strategists could design. She rested her elbows on the table and folded her hands beneath her chin, staring quietly at the document. The silence of the room pressed in around her again, but it did not feel heavy anymore. It felt focused, like the calm center of something important about to move. Earlier that day she had spoken because her instincts told her something was wrong. Now she understood just how wrong it had been. The door behind her opened softly. Maya looked up as Veronica Ellison stepped inside the office, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The older woman set one beside the binder and studied Maya's expression carefully. "Well," Veronica said calmly, "I can tell by your face you found something." Maya nodded slowly and turned the binder toward her. "Yes, ma'am. And I think the problem is bigger than the room realized." The security office smelled faintly of floor polish and burnt coffee from a machine that had probably been running since dawn. Maya Williams sat upright in the metal chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, her janitor badge resting against the faded fabric of her hoodie. The marble lobby beyond the glass door gleamed under cold morning light, but inside the small room the air felt thick and unmoving, like time had paused to watch what would happen next. Her mother Denise sat beside her, shoulders stiff, fingers gripping the strap of her cleaning bag, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Neither of them spoke. Every few seconds Maya could hear the distant hum of elevators gliding up and down the building's spine. Somewhere 27 floors above them, powerful men in expensive suits were reading the same clause she had pointed to, or ignoring it, or laughing about it. She did not know which possibility made her stomach twist more. A security guard behind the desk flipped lazily through a magazine, pretending not to stare, but every so often his eyes drifted toward Maya with quiet curiosity. She knew what he was thinking. Just a kid. Just the janitor's daughter. Someone who had stepped into a room where people like her were not supposed to speak. Denise finally exhaled slowly. "You should not have said anything," she whispered, not angry, just tired. "Those people do not like being corrected." Maya kept her eyes on the tiled floor. "I know. They could fire me. I know." Silence returned, heavier now. But Maya's mind refused to quiet. She could still see the document in her head as clearly as if it were lying on the desk in front of her. Page 14. Liability transfer. Subparagraph C. The wording had been careful, polished, hidden behind legal language designed to blur responsibility. But the meaning had been obvious once you slowed down and read it without assumptions. If Jackson Hale signed that contract, every lawsuit, every regulatory penalty, every hidden debt from the merger would land squarely on Hale Investments. Vaughn Global would walk away untouched. It was the kind of trap that only worked when people believed they were too important to double-check the details. Upstairs, inside the glass conference room, the mood had shifted. Jackson Hale stood at the head of the long marble table, the contract spread open before him. The room that had once buzzed with confident conversation now carried the tight quiet of something fragile cracking. Around him, executives leaned closer to their tablets and printed pages, scrolling, scanning, whispering under their breath. Derek Vaughn remained seated, his polished smile still in place, but thinner now, stretched like plastic over something tense beneath. Jackson flipped to page 14 again. His silver pen rested beside the document, untouched. His finger traced the clause slowly, line by line. At first glance it looked harmless. Standard liability structure. Compliance language. The kind lawyers copied from older contracts without thinking. But once he reached the third line, the same line Maya had pointed to, his brow tightened almost imperceptibly. The wording did something subtle. Responsibility shifted. Quietly. Completely. One of the younger analysts cleared his throat. "Sir, if interpreted literally, this would transfer post-merger litigation exposure entirely to us." Derek leaned back in his chair with a low chuckle meant to sound relaxed. Surely we are not taking contract advice from someone who pushes a mop down the hallway. But no one laughed this time. Jackson's eyes remained on the page. Slowly he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. Beneath his weight, for a long moment he said nothing. The city skyline glowed beyond the glass wall behind him, bright and indifferent. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm enough to still the room. "Pull the original draft history," he said. "Every revision. I want to know when that clause appeared." Across the table, Derek Vaughn's smile faded just a fraction. And far below in the quiet security office, Maya Williams sat perfectly still, unaware that the silence she had left behind in that boardroom was beginning to move. The silence in the boardroom did not break when the door closed behind Maya Williams. It thickened. Jackson Hale remained seated at the head of the long walnut table, the contract still open beneath his hand, the silver pen resting untouched between his fingers. Around him, executives shifted in their chairs with the quiet discomfort of people who had just witnessed something that did not fit the rules of their world. A janitor's daughter interrupting a billion-dollar merger. A 16-year-old speaking with the calm certainty of someone twice her age. Derek Vaughn leaned back slowly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket as if the moment meant nothing. "Well," he said lightly, forcing a thin smile. "That was entertaining." No one laughed. Jackson's eyes were still on page 14. The fluorescent ceiling lights reflected across the polished table and the crisp white pages of legal language. Paragraph C, subsection 3. He read it once. Then again. The room felt colder now, though the thermostat had not moved a single degree. Clara Hale watched him carefully from across the table, her fingers resting against a crystal water glass. "Jackson," she said quietly, "surely you are not taking that girl seriously." He did not answer right away. Instead, he lifted the contract slightly and slid it closer, his brow tightening as he followed the paragraph line by line. The clause looked harmless at first glance. Dense, technical, wrapped in language designed to calm rather than alarm. But buried inside the structure of the sentence was a shift, a single redirection of liability, subtle enough to escape a tired reader, dangerous enough to destroy a company. Jackson's jaw flexed. Across the table, one of the younger attorneys leaned forward, curiosity overtaking hesitation. "Sir," the man said carefully, "may I see that page?" Jackson slid the document toward him without looking up. Papers rustled softly as two more executives leaned closer. The attorney's finger traced the paragraph slowly. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. Finally, the young man inhaled sharply. "That is unusual." Derek Vaughn chuckled again, though the sound was thinner now. Legal language always looks strange if you stare at it long enough. But the attorney was already flipping through earlier sections of the contract, scanning for cross-references. Another lawyer opened his tablet and began comparing the digital draft. The quiet tapping of keys echoed faintly across the table. Jackson leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting toward the glass wall of the conference room. Beyond it, the city stretched across the afternoon sky, towers and traffic glowing in late sunlight. Somewhere 27 floors below, a teenage girl sat in a security office wearing borrowed sneakers and a janitor's badge. The image would not leave his mind. The way she had spoken. Not loudly, not arrogantly, simply certain. Derek's voice cut through the silence again. "Jackson, if we delay this deal over the imagination of a maintenance worker's kid, we will look ridiculous." Jackson finally turned his head. His expression was calm, but the calm carried weight now. "Ridiculous," he repeated quietly. He glanced back toward the attorneys. "Well," the young lawyer swallowed. "If interpreted the way it is written here, Vaughn Global would transfer all post-merger litigation exposure to Hale Investments." Another executive frowned. "Meaning what exactly?" The attorney's voice lowered. "Meaning if anything fails after the merger, lawsuits, regulatory penalties, debt restructuring, we absorb the full financial responsibility." The room fell still again. Derek Vaughn's smile faded by a fraction. Jackson rested both hands on the table now, the contract lying open between them like a silent witness. The air conditioner hummed softly overhead. Somewhere down the hall a copier machine beeped. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. Yet inside the boardroom the weight of realization was settling slowly across every face. Jackson's gaze moved once more toward the door Maya had walked through minutes earlier. For the briefest moment he imagined the alternative. Signing the page without reading deeper. Celebrating the deal. Discovering the truth months later when the damage could not be undone. His voice when it finally came was low but unmistakably firm. "Pause the merger review," he said. Chairs shifted instantly. Pens stopped moving. Derek Vaughn straightened in his seat, the confidence in his posture tightening. "Jackson, surely you are not." Jackson raised a single hand, and the room fell silent again. His eyes remained steady. "Before I sign anything," he said, "I want every word of this contract verified." The quiet that followed was different now. Not confusion, not tension, something closer to awakening. And somewhere downstairs in the marble lobby, the girl who had spoken up when no one expected it sat waiting, unaware that the most powerful man in the building had just begun to wonder if the quietest voice in the room had been the only honest one. Jackson Hale did not sign the contract that afternoon. The pen remained on the polished walnut table long after the executives had left the room, its silver tip catching the cold white light from the ceiling panels. For nearly 10 minutes after Maya was escorted out, no one spoke. Derek Vaughn leaned back slowly in his leather chair, fingers steepled, the polite smile on his face beginning to thin at the edges. Jackson flipped to page 14 again. The paper rustled softly in the quiet boardroom. Paragraph C, line 3. It looked ordinary at first glance, buried in dense legal phrasing designed to blur responsibility and soften risk. But once he saw it, he could not unsee it. The wording did not merely share liability. It shifted it entirely. His company would carry every legal consequence after the merger, while Vaughn Global walked away untouched. Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. Clara Hale shifted beside him, impatience creeping into her voice. Jackson, this is ridiculous. Are we really delaying a billion-dollar agreement because a janitor's daughter wanted attention? But Jackson was no longer listening to her. His attention had narrowed to the sentence in front of him, each word suddenly sharp as glass. Across the table, one of the younger legal analysts quietly cleared his throat. Sir, if you read the cross-reference to subsection 7, it confirms the liability transfer. Derek Vaughn chuckled lightly, though the sound carried a strain now. Gentlemen, contracts are always full of technical language. Surely we are not entertaining legal advice from someone who cleans your floors. Jackson slowly set the document down. His gaze lifted toward Vaughn, calm but colder than before. You seem very confident I would not read this closely. Vaughn's smile flickered. I trust my partners. Jackson tapped the clause once with his finger. That clause hands my company every lawsuit that could follow this merger. Silence thickened in the room. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed louder. One executive pulled his tablet closer, scrolling quickly. Another flipped through the printed pages with growing urgency. Finally, the analyst spoke again, voice tight. Sir, she was correct. The clause does transfer full liability to Hale Investments. Derek Vaughn straightened slightly, his expression hardening now that the mask had slipped. Jackson exhaled slowly through his nose. A memory flashed through his mind. The girl standing in the doorway. Borrowed sneakers. Maintenance badge. Calm voice cutting through the room. You can laugh, but if he signs that, your company takes the fall. His fingers curled loosely around the pen before he set it aside entirely. This meeting is over, Jackson said quietly. Vaughn leaned forward. Let us not be dramatic. Every contract has negotiable language. Jackson met his gaze, steady and unreadable. Then why hide it where only someone patient enough to read every line would notice? Vaughn said nothing. That was answer enough. Chairs shifted around the table as tension spread through the room. Clara's face had gone pale. Jackson stood slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. For years he had trusted instinct when choosing partners. Today, that instinct had nearly cost him everything. And the warning had not come from his lawyers. Not from his advisors. It had come from a 16-year-old girl holding a janitor badge. Jackson turned toward the door, already thinking several steps ahead. Call compliance, he told the analyst. Run a full audit on every clause Vaughn's team submitted. The analyst nodded quickly. Yes, sir. As Jackson reached the doorway, he paused. Something unsettled sat quietly in his chest. Not anger. Not relief. Something closer to recognition. In the reflection of the glass wall, he saw again the moment she looked back at him before security closed the door. Calm. Certain. Not asking to be believed. Only refusing to stay silent. Downstairs in the security office, Maya Williams sat with her hands folded in her lap, while the marble lobby reflected the late afternoon sunlight across the floor. She had no idea that 3 floors above her, an entire billion-dollar deal had just collapsed because someone finally read the sentence she refused to ignore. The hallway outside the security office smelled faintly. Of floor polish and cold morning air drifting in each time the glass doors opened. Maya Williams sat upright in the plastic chair, her hands folded calmly in her lap, though her heartbeat still tapped quietly against her ribs. Beside her, Denise stared at the marble floor, shoulders tight with worry. An hour earlier, security had escorted Maya out of the boardroom like she had committed a crime. Now the entire building seemed to be holding its breath. Footsteps approached down the corridor, slow and deliberate. When the door opened, the man standing there was no longer the same executive who had ordered her removed. Jackson Hale looked older somehow, the sharp authority in his posture softened by something heavier. Behind him trailed 2 senior legal advisors and a young analyst clutching a tablet. No one spoke at first. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them. Jackson's eyes settled on Maya. Miss Williams, he said quietly. Not janitor's daughter. Not the girl who interrupted. Just her name. Maya rose politely. Yes, sir. He stepped into the room, glancing briefly at Denise before returning his focus to Maya. My legal team reviewed the clause you pointed out. He paused, the silence stretching like a thin wire between them. You were correct. Denise inhaled sharply. One of the advisors shifted uncomfortably. Maya simply nodded once. She had already known. Jackson studied her face carefully, as if expecting triumph, or anger, or even quiet satisfaction. But there was none. Only the same calm steadiness she had shown inside the boardroom. That clause would have transferred nearly $800 million in liability to my company, Jackson continued. If we had signed it this morning, we would have spent the next decade fighting lawsuits. The young analyst swallowed and looked down at his tablet. You stopped that from happening. Another pause followed, heavier this time. Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. And I had you escorted out. Maya's voice remained gentle. You had a lot happening in that room, sir. The words were not defensive. They were not bitter. They were simply true. That seemed to affect him more than any accusation could have. He exhaled slowly and rubbed his temple for a second before lowering his hand again. Most people in your position would be angry right now, he admitted. Maya tilted her head slightly, considering the thought. Anger would not change the contract, sir. One of the advisors glanced at her with quiet surprise. Jackson almost smiled, though the expression faded quickly. You understand something most executives in that building still struggle with. He stepped closer now, lowering his voice slightly. You could have stayed silent. Let us sign. Watched everything collapse. Maya looked at the polished floor for a brief moment before meeting his eyes again. My grandfather used to say something, she said softly. Just because someone has more power than you does not mean you should let them make a bigger mistake. The room grew still again. Even the guard near the door seemed to lean in slightly. Jackson studied her as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time. You protected a company that barely knows you exist, he said. Maya's answer came without hesitation. I protected the people who work here, sir. Mistakes like that do not just hurt executives. They hurt assistants, janitors, security guards, everyone. Denise blinked rapidly beside her. Jackson's gaze shifted briefly toward the hallway outside, where employees moved quietly past the glass walls of the lobby. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. He looked back at Maya, something thoughtful settling behind his eyes. Most boardrooms talk about responsibility, he said slowly. You actually practiced it. Maya gave a small shrug, almost shy. Someone had to read page 14. For the first time since entering the room, Jackson Hale let out a quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. Not mocking, not dismissive, human. And in that moment, standing under the pale office lights with a janitor's daughter who had just saved his company from disaster, Jackson felt a realization settle deep in his chest. Power had filled that boardroom all morning, but integrity had walked in wearing borrowed sneakers and a maintenance badge. Morning light spilled across the glass walls of Hale Investments like pale gold, quiet and clean, but the building did not feel the same. Conversations were softer. Footsteps slowed when they passed the security desk. The story had traveled overnight through emails, late calls, and tense legal reviews. Page 14 had been real. The clause had been exactly what the girl said it was. A trap disguised in polite legal language. And every senior attorney who reviewed it after midnight had reached the same conclusion. If Jackson Hale had signed that document, his company could have collapsed under years of lawsuits. Inside his office on the 27th floor, Jackson stood beside the window, the contract spread across his desk, red annotations covering the page like scars. His pen rested untouched between his fingers. He had not slept. Across the room, Clara watched him carefully, her voice quieter than usual. The lawyers confirmed it, she said. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked again at the paragraph the girl had pointed to. The same thin line of text that nearly cost him everything. Finally, he exhaled slowly. Call the lobby. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors opened on the executive floor with a soft metallic chime. Maya Williams stepped out cautiously beside her mother, Denise. The marble hallway seemed even larger during the day, the windows brighter, the silence heavier. Maya kept her chin level, but her fingers pressed lightly against the strap of her backpack. She had expected to be dismissed from the building forever. Instead, a security officer had politely escorted them upstairs. When the office doors opened, the boardroom was already full again. The same executives from yesterday sat around the long glass table, but their expressions had changed. No one laughed now. Jackson Hale stood at the far end of the room. For a moment, no one spoke. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and morning coffee. Maya noticed the contract lying open on the table. Page 14 was folded outward like a quiet confession. Jackson walked slowly toward her. Up close, he looked older than yesterday, the lines around his eyes deeper, the confidence in his posture replaced by something more deliberate. He stopped a few feet away and studied her carefully, not as a stranger this time, but as someone whose voice had already changed the course of his company. "Miss Williams," he said at last, his voice steady but lower than usual. "Yesterday, I asked security to remove you from this room. That was my mistake." The executives shifted slightly in their chairs. Maya remained still. "You saw something that an entire board of professionals failed to see." Jackson continued. "And you spoke up when it would have been easier to stay silent." He reached down and turned the contract so everyone could see the marked page. Because of that decision, this company avoided a disaster worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The room remained completely quiet. Denise glanced at her daughter, stunned. Jackson looked directly at Maya again. "May I ask you something?" She nodded once. "When you saw that clause, why did you risk speaking up? You did not work here. You had nothing to gain." Maya hesitated only a second. "Because it was wrong, sir. If someone signs something without understanding it, that is not business. That is a trick." A faint murmur moved through the room. Jackson held her gaze for a long moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Respect. Simple and unmistakable. He picked up the pen from the table and closed the contract firmly. Integrity, he said quietly, does not come from titles. Sometimes it comes from the person everyone else overlooked. Then he turned slightly toward the executives. Effective immediately, this merger is suspended pending a full investigation. Legal will rewrite every clause. And Miss Williams will be compensated for bringing this issue forward. Maya blinked, surprised. But Jackson was not finished. He stepped closer, his tone now calm but sincere. "If you ever choose to study business or law, my company will sponsor your education. Not as charity, as an investment." The sunlight brightened across the room as if the building itself had exhaled. Maya did not smile widely. She only nodded once, steady and thoughtful. Because the most powerful thing in that moment was not the offer. It was the silence of an entire room finally learning to listen. Morning light spread slowly across the glass towers of Hale Investments, turning the long windows into pale mirrors of the waking city. The lobby that once felt cold and distant now carried a quieter rhythm. Shoes moved across the marble floor. Elevators chimed softly. And near the front desk, framed beside a simple bronze plaque, hung a small laminated badge that read Maintenance Visitor. Maya Williams. Most people who passed it never knew the story behind it, but a few did, and those few always slowed down for a moment. 3 months had passed since the contract incident that almost cost the company everything. 3 months since a girl in borrowed sneakers had spoken a single sentence that froze a boardroom full of powerful executives. The investigation that followed had been quiet but thorough. Lawyers reviewed every clause. Independent auditors confirmed the trap exactly as Maya described it. Vaughn Global had quietly withdrawn from negotiations 2 weeks later, offering polite excuses that fooled no one. Jackson Hale never mentioned the humiliation publicly, but inside the company the shift was unmistakable. Meetings grew slower. Documents were read twice. Junior analysts were suddenly encouraged to question things instead of staying silent. Integrity had become a word people actually used again. And sometimes, when the elevators opened on the 27th floor, employees would glance toward the conference room where it all happened and remember the moment a janitor's daughter stopped a billion-dollar mistake. Jackson stood near the window of his office now, hands resting loosely on the sill. Below him, the Hudson River moved like dark glass under the morning sun. Clara had once called the view the most expensive silence in Manhattan. Today it felt different. Less like power, more like responsibility. His assistant stepped quietly inside. "Sir, the Williams Scholarship Committee is ready downstairs." Jackson nodded slowly. "Send them up." When the door closed again, his eyes drifted briefly to the object resting on his desk. Not a contract, not a report, just a simple spiral notebook. Inside were handwritten notes in careful lettering. Observations about corporate risk, questions about ethical oversight, small ideas scribbled in the margins. Maya had written them during the 2 weeks she spent reviewing company documents after the incident. She never asked for recognition, never asked for money. The scholarship had been Jackson's idea. One full academic ride every year for a student who noticed problems others ignored. He had named it quietly, the Williams Fellowship. The elevator doors opened moments later, and 3 teenagers stepped hesitantly into the office, guided by a young assistant. Nervous smiles, carefully pressed jackets, bright eyes full of possibility. Jackson greeted them with a warmth that would have surprised the man he used to be. As they spoke about business ethics, about law school dreams and engineering plans, his gaze occasionally moved back toward the city beyond the glass. Somewhere out there, Maya Williams was living a life far away from boardrooms and contracts. She had chosen a small state university in Georgia, studying public policy on a scholarship the company insisted she accept. The last email she sent Jackson had only one sentence. "Thank you for listening when it mattered." He still thought about that line sometimes. Because the truth was simple. She had not changed the company with money or power. She had changed it with courage. Outside, sunlight brightened the river until it shimmered silver. Inside, the conversation between the students and the old billionaire grew easier, lighter. For the first time in years, the room did not feel like a place where decisions crushed people. It felt like a place where people tried to do better. Jackson glanced once more at the small notebook on his desk before closing it gently. Some lessons arrived in million-dollar reports. Others arrived in borrowed sneakers and a quiet voice brave enough to speak. Maya Williams had not owned the company. She had not controlled the room. But on the day everyone else stayed silent, she reminded them what decency sounded like. And that was the moment everything began to change.